history isn't only about what happened, it's also about the stories that almost were. We tend to think of the past as fixed, carved in stone, but history is more like a river. Change just one bend, one current, and everything downstream begins to shift. Most of us were taught that in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. That single voyage, we're told, opened the floodgates between the Old World and the New, launching an age of empires and exploration. But 5 centuries before Columbus, wooden ships cut across the same Atlantic waters. They weren't royal galleons, they were longships. Their sails were striped red and white, their prows carved with dragons. On board were Norse settlers, farmers, hunters, warriors, men and women used to cold seas and harsher winds. They built homes of timber and turf. They fished salmon-rich rivers. They met the people who already lived there. They fought and traded, lived and died on the shores of a place they called Vinland. In our timeline, their colony flickered out in less than a decade, leaving only a faint trace at a site we now know as Lands o' Meadows. But history didn't have to turn out that way. Imagine if their fires never dimmed. If, instead of abandoning the settlement, they chose to stay, to endure the winters, to learn from the land and its people, and to weave themselves into the fabric of a continent half a millennium before Columbus was born. That single choice could have redrawn the map of the world. But before we wade too far into this what if, make sure you're comfortable. Turn on the fan if you need to, pull the blankets close, and let yourself sink into the quiet. And if you'd like to keep traveling with me through history, do well to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. You can also tell me which period of history you'd love to hear next. I always read through your ideas. Now, with the world growing still, let's begin our journey.
Forget 1492. The year that could have changed everything is 1010. In our history, this was when the Vikings packed their tools and slipped back across the North Atlantic, leaving Vinland behind. They'd faced skirmishes with local tribes, endured a merciless climate, and felt the pull of home across the sea. Their outpost was small, fragile, vulnerable, and so they let the dream go. But picture another path. A small group of settlers gathers on a rocky headland overlooking a dark fjord. Snow is falling in thick, slow flakes. At their center stands Bjorn Iron-Willed, a man with weathered hands and eyes as steady as the sea. He knows what failure means, another generation condemned to the thin pastures of Greenland, another chance lost to make a life beyond the ice. Bjorn doesn't see the indigenous peoples as faceless foes. He sees a chance, the only chance, to survive. Where others imagine conquest or retreat, he sees cooperation. He sets rules. No theft from neighbors, no reckless fights, no pride above survival. He begins to trade, to listen, and to build bridges instead of barricades. That decision, quiet and almost invisible, is the first domino in a chain reaction that reshapes the next 1,000 years. Instead of a forgotten footnote, Vinland becomes a colony that holds on. Families arrive. Children are born between cultures. Timbered halls rise beside bark lodges. The Norse learn which berries heal and which kill, how to fish under ice, how to plant seeds native to the soil. And across the ocean, Europe will one day look west and see not an untouched continent, but a shore already alive with ships, markets, and iron-wielding farmers. From this moment, from a leader's calm resolve on a frozen morning, the fate of 2 worlds begins to change.
To understand how the Vikings might have carved out a lasting foothold in North America, we first have to look with unflinching clarity at why they failed. The Viking arrival in the New World was not a thunderclap of conquest. It wasn't legions storming a coastline under a blood-red banner. It began quietly, almost hesitantly, with the soft splash of oars on cold water. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, steered his longship west from Greenland. The Icelandic sagas tell how he reached a strange and generous land, which he named Vinland for the wild grapes clinging to its riverbanks. Today, archaeologists point to Lonsau Meadows on the tip of Newfoundland as the likely site of this first Norse landing. What they built there was small, a handful of turf-roofed longhouses, a simple smithy, evidence of boat repair. It wasn't a settlement so much as a toehold, the kind of place that says only, "We were here," for a breath of time. They explored creeks and inlets, felled trees for timber, hunted caribou and salmon, even bartered with the people already living on that coast. And yet, within 10 years, Vinland was abandoned, a ghost of potential. Why did they give up? To the Norse, Vinland looked like salvation after the wind-scoured rocks of Greenland. Timber stood in endless ranks, salmon filled the rivers, game wandered the clearings. The sagas describe meadows so rich that cattle could graze through winter, a dream for farmers who scratched a living from thin Icelandic soil. But paradise had teeth. Its winters, though softer than Greenland's, were still bitter to men accustomed to the Gulf Stream's milder touch. Crops were strange and unreliable. The settlers were cut off by 1,500 miles of ocean from Iceland, nearly twice that from Norway. Their lifeline was thin and frayed. If trouble came, no army or fleet could rush to their rescue. And trouble did come, not from the sea, but from the forest.
Beyond their turf walls lived people the sagas call skraelings, a word that probably meant screamers or wretches. It was not a kind name. These were likely the Beothuk and perhaps other Algonquin-speaking groups. To them, the newcomers were strange, pale-skinned strangers with beards and iron axes, chopping trees and fencing pastures that were not theirs. At first, the two groups tested each other cautiously. There were exchanges, furs for red cloth, fish for milk. But suspicion lay under every meeting. The Norse, with iron blades and chain mail, held a sharp technological edge, but the locals had the home advantage and far greater numbers. One saga tells of a bull that escaped from the Norse camp, bellowing wildly and terrifying nearby hunters. That moment spiraled into a clash, and soon all hope of steady peace collapsed. Cut off from help, outnumbered, struggling against the cold, the settlers burned their houses, packed their tools, and rode for Greenland. Their brief story ended as abruptly as it began. That is where our history closes the book. But suppose one man had refused. In this alternate world, history hinges on a single figure, Bjorn Iron-Willed. Bjorn is no berserker in a horned helmet. He's a Greenlander, born where survival means cunning as much as courage. Winters have carved patience into him. He knows strength isn't in how loudly you boast, but in how long you endure. It is 1010 AD. The Norse settlement stands on the edge of collapse. Skirmishes flicker around its borders, morale droops under snow-laden roofs. Bjorn steps forward and makes a decision that will bend the fate of continents. They will stay. Bjorn's first act is to reshape the settlement itself. No more a scattering of turf huts clinging to the soil. He orders a proper stronghold, a stave fortress in the Norse style, but adapted for siege. Wooden palisades ring the houses, watchtowers give long sight over the fjord, foundations are set with stone to resist frost and assault alike. He names it Vinneborg, Friend's Fortress, a quiet promise that they intend to hold their ground.
The Vesterfolk carried a confidence their parents had lacked. To them, the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a story whispered by their grandparents. Their loyalties lay with the land they were born to, a place of spruce and pine, of moose trails and cod shoals. They hunted with bows tipped in iron, sang sagas to drums, and carved the first local runestones, etched not only with Norse letters, but with pictographs learned from native teachers. As populations swelled, so did ambition. Clearing forest for pastures created room for sheep and hardy cattle, whose milk sweetened the diet. Barley grew in small plots, beans and squash crept up their stalks, a gift from indigenous neighbors. Trade broadened. Furs remained the blood life: beaver, fox, marten, lynx, but new goods joined the barter: smoked eels, carved bone pens, maple sugar, beeswax candles, walrus ivory from Greenland. Vineborg became a marketplace, where sledges from inland camps jostled beside longships from the east. Seasonal fairs sprang up near harbors. Here, Norse merchants haggled in broken Algonquian. Hunters displayed pelts on pine racks. Children darted through crowds clutching carved toys or roasted trout on sticks. Such gatherings were not without risk. Disputes over prices or insults could turn to brawls, yet most ended with shared feasts, songs in mixed tongues, and cautious handshakes sealing new bargains. This expanding economy tied Vineborg ever more tightly to Europe. Greenland's outposts thrived as way stations. Icelandic traders risked longer crossings to fetch furs, timber, and dried fish. A few hardy Norwegians even made the voyage, lured by profits whispered in Bergen taverns. But the settlers guarded their independence. While they welcomed goods, better iron, goats, occasional barrels of mead, they resisted attempts by distant kings to tax or govern them. The ocean was their shield as much as their road.
Bjorn also institutes an innovation that will define Vineborg's survival: seasonal rotation. Each summer, longships sail back to Greenland and Iceland, not to abandon the venture, but to sustain it. They return with tools, livestock, even seed grain. More crucially, they carry families: women, children, elders, settlers who plan to root themselves, not just raid. With them, the Norse transform. They cease to be wandering traders and become colonists. By the mid-1020s, Vineborg has grown beyond its original clearing. Outlying hamlets sprout along river mouths, each palisaded and linked by narrow trails or water routes. Trade with neighboring tribes flows through these posts: iron for furs, cloth for smoked fish, nails for carved snowshoes. Children born here know no other world. They wear moccasins stitched with Norse brooches, paddle birch bark canoes, yet sleep beneath carved roof beams. Their lullabies mingle sagas of Thor and Freya with forest tales of spirits and trickster animals. A Creole language begins to form, Old Norse laced with Algonquin words. The Norse church notices. A priest arrives one summer carrying a small cross and books in a waxed chest, but Christian prayers mingle with invocations to Thor and the whispered charms of the woodlands. Faith, like language, becomes hybrid. Greenland, once a hungry outpost, suddenly thrives as a middle station on a new trade road. Pelts of beaver, fox, and otter sail east, fetching high prices in Norway. In return, the Vinlanders receive better iron, more sheep and goats, hardy ponies, even a few precious cows. Norway's kings begin to view this far shore not as a rumor, but an asset. Yet Bjorn keeps his gaze steady on the basics: grain bins, salt fish, winter fodder. He orders forges to smelt local bog iron. He teaches settlers to cultivate beans, barley, squash, and hardy native tubers. Vineborg edges towards self-sufficiency.
By the dawn of the 12th century, the Norse colony in Vinland had passed its first great test. The longhouses of Vineborg still smoked against the winter sky. Children's laughter mingled with the clang of hammers. What began as a desperate gamble had become something solid, stubborn, and alive. But survival was only the beginning. Over the next 100 years, the settlers of Vineborg and the people who welcomed or warred with them would be remade by this place. They would shed old skins, graft new customs, and grow into a society that neither Scandinavia nor the First Peoples could have foreseen. In its earliest decades, Vineborg was a frontier post clinging to a hostile coast. By 1100, it had become a network of outposts, stretching along the bays and rivers of what we call Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Timber palisades guarded each settlement, but the log walls also framed new possibilities: trade, marriage, invention, and language. The settlers could not remain the Vikings of legend. The realities of North America, its size, its climate, and its long-standing cultures made raiding impractical and isolation fatal. They learned to read tides, track animals, and sow crops suited to shorter seasons. They bartered with neighbors for maple sugar, tobacco, and fine pelts. They learned to paddle canoes through shallow streams where their heavy ships could never go. Iron, their greatest treasure, sped this evolution. A single steel axe could clear a plot of land in half the time of a stone blade. Iron arrowheads bit deeper than bone or flint. A cooking pot of hammered metal could last for decades. These tools rippled through the trade networks of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, and Algonquian-speaking peoples, making friends of some and uneasy rivals of others.
But technology was only part of the exchange. Far more powerful was the flow of knowledge, the quiet lessons traded around fires and over fish racks. The settlers learned which berries healed fevers, which herbs soothed an infant's stomach, which trees bled sweet sap in spring. They watched how local hunters read the wind, how women tanned hides soft as cloth, how shamans painted stories onto bark and skin. From their side, the Norse offered their own crafts: forge work, carpentry, wool weaving, rope making. They shared how to caulk a hull with pitch, how to smoke fish inside a hut so it stayed edible for months, how to fashion hinges and locks from wrought iron. Even small skills, sharpening a blade to a fine edge or weaving nettle fiber into twine, found eager pupils. As this exchange deepened, barriers between peoples thinned. Marriages, at first rare and strategic, became more common. A trader's daughter might wed a hunter's son. A Norse farmer might take a local bride whose clan held prime fishing rights. These unions were not always simple. Some elders warned against diluting ancestry or offending spirits. Others, more pragmatic, saw that kinship brought security in lean years. Children born of these marriages grew up with feet in two worlds. They learned Old Norse hymns beside Algonquin chants. Their mothers wrapped them in furs stitched with bone needles, while fathers carved wooden toys shaped like longships. Around the hearth, tales of Thor and Freya sat easily beside stories of Gluskap or the trickster crow. Over time, these children stopped being half anything. They were Vesterfolk, the West people. They spoke a Creole tongue, blending Norse nouns with Algonquin verbs, borrowing words for snow, forest, salmon, and stars from whichever language fit best. Their speech was music to both sides, though sometimes puzzling to elders.
The Vesterfolk carried a confidence their parents had lacked. To them, the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a story whispered by their grandparents. Their loyalties lay with the land they were born to, a place of spruce and pine, of moose trails and cod shoals. They hunted with bows tipped in iron, sang sagas to drums, and carved the first local runestones, etched not only with Norse letters, but with pictographs learned from native teachers. As populations swelled, so did ambition. Clearing forest for pastures created room for sheep and hardy cattle, whose milk sweetened the diet. Barley grew in small plots, beans and squash crept up their stalks, a gift from indigenous neighbors. Trade broadened. Furs remained the blood life: beaver, fox, marten, lynx, but new goods joined the barter: smoked eels, carved bone pens, maple sugar, beeswax candles, walrus ivory from Greenland. Vineborg became a marketplace, where sledges from inland camps jostled beside longships from the east. Seasonal fairs sprang up near harbors. Here, Norse merchants haggled in broken Algonquian. Hunters displayed pelts on pine racks. Children darted through crowds clutching carved toys or roasted trout on sticks. Such gatherings were not without risk. Disputes over prices or insults could turn to brawls, yet most ended with shared feasts, songs in mixed tongues, and cautious handshakes sealing new bargains. This expanding economy tied Vineborg ever more tightly to Europe. Greenland's outposts thrived as way stations. Icelandic traders risked longer crossings to fetch furs, timber, and dried fish. A few hardy Norwegians even made the voyage, lured by profits whispered in Bergen taverns. But the settlers guarded their independence. While they welcomed goods, better iron, goats, occasional barrels of mead, they resisted attempts by distant kings to tax or govern them. The ocean was their shield as much as their road.
With growth came the need for clearer leadership. Bjorn Iron-Willed had ruled by charisma and the weight of experience. After his death, Eirik the Quiet proved a patient mediator, content to let consensus guide decisions. Yet as settlements multiplied, so did quarrels, disputes over timber stands, fishing grounds, and bride prices between clans of mixed heritage. A council evolved, part Norse thing, part tribal gathering. Representatives met each summer at Vineborg. Jarls, respected hunters, women skilled in healing or trade. They debated under open sky, settling arguments with compensation or rarely outlawry. Justice prized restoration over vengeance, a blend of Norse law codes and local customs about balance. Religion followed a similar path. A small chapel stood near the fort's gate, tended by priests from Greenland, but its altar shared space with carved wooden figures and stone amulets left by hunters seeking luck. Some families baptized their children, then hung Thor's hammer charms around their necks. Others honored the forest spirits with tobacco or fish. Belief here was less about dogma than about maintaining harmony with forces, old and new, that shaped survival. The century was not without trials. Harsh winters struck in cycles. One decade might bring deep snow and starving wolves, the next, mild seasons and overflowing salmon runs. Epidemics arrived slowly along trade routes from Europe. Coughs that clung to lungs, fevers that thinned villages. Loss was real, but never the sudden apocalypse that later centuries would unleash. Relations with neighboring tribes remained complex. Some resented the colony's expansion, others relied on its iron. Small wars flared, mostly over hunting grounds or insulted honor, but diplomacy often mended rifts. A few young warriors even sought service with Norse jarls, trading loyalty for steel and training. By 1150, a generation born entirely in Vinland began to hold sway. These Vesterfolk were tall, broad-shouldered, their faces blending northern pallor with warmer hues from inland clans. They dressed in wool tunics belted over leggings of smoked hide, their hair braided or bound with leather. They were comfortable at sea and in forest alike.
They also began to dream beyond simple survival. Some scouted south along the coasts of Nova Scotia and Maine, mapping estuaries rich in shellfish. Others paddled westward up the St. Lawrence, bringing back tales of vast lakes and herds of shaggy beasts grazing on open plains. Such stories stirred imaginations in Vineborg's Hole, where carved maps on birch bark began to grow crowded with charcoal marks. These explorers carried not only ambition, but also caution. They knew how fragile life on the edge could be.
Every new post was fortified, every alliance carefully brokered. Yet their steady push hinted at something unprecedented, a permanent Norse-American society ready to expand beyond its cradle. By the late 12th century, daily life in Vinland hummed with blended rhythm. Mornings smelled of peat fires and smoked fish. Children recited fragments of the poetic Edda before running off to check trap lines. Women spun wool beside friends, weaving intricate quill work. Men mended nets or joined hunters, stalking moose through frosted marsh. Evenings brought communal meals, venison stew thickened with barley, bannocks baked on flat stones, dried berries soaked in honeyed water. Afterward, stories unrolled, sagas of Eric the Red, myths of shape-shifting creatures from the forests, parables of wise ravens. Listeners sat shoulder to shoulder, lulled by firelight and the low drone of a drum. Art flourished quietly. Bone and antler became combs and game pieces etched with runes. Birch bark bore painted scenes of hunts and voyages. Carvers blended Norse knotwork with flowing native motifs, creating a style wholly their own. Songs carried echoes of fjords and deep woods, their words stitched from two languages, but sung as one. As 1200 approached, Vinneborg stood not merely as a colony, but as the heart of a new people. They had endured famine, negotiated with rivals, welcomed strangers, and buried elders whose wisdom shaped a common path. They were no longer just settlers clinging to foreign soil. They were the Vesterfolk, children of both Norse fjords and American forests.
Their ships, sleeker than the first clumsy Nars, hugged the coastlines on trading runs. Their canoes slipped inland, carrying iron knives and dyed wool to far-off bands. Their sense of identity grew firmer. They were neither wholly European nor wholly indigenous, but something stitched together by hardship and hope. From their watchtowers, young guards scanned horizons not only for danger, but for opportunity. They wondered what lay beyond the rivers, beyond the mists over hidden lakes. They knew their grandparents had crossed an ocean. Perhaps their own journeys would cross continents. For now, though, the heart of their world remained Vinneborg, a cluster of timber halls and sod cottages surrounded by spruce and saltaire, a place where smoke curled above roofs and the smell of roasting salmon drifted from hearths. Here, the descendants of Bjorn Iron-Willed and his allies forged a civilization that would one day meet kings and empires on equal terms. The Vesterfolk were here to stay.
By the opening of the 12th century's final decades, Vinland was no longer a scattering of wooden halls clinging to a harsh shore. It had become a living tapestry, woven from the threads of Norse tenacity and indigenous wisdom, strengthened by the new generation born of both. The Vestfolk, as they called themselves, were shaping something sturdier than a colony. They were crafting a kingdom. The settlements that dotted Newfoundland's bays and the Gulf of St. Lawrence had begun as outposts, guarded clearings beside river mouths where traders bartered furs for iron. But the steady rhythm of births, harvests, and voyages knitted these posts together. By the mid-1100s, leaders from Vinneborg and its satellites met yearly to weigh disputes and plan defenses. At first, these meetings were informal. A tent raised near the shore, delegates sitting on driftwood benches. Over time, custom hardened into institution. A high jarl, chosen by acclaim from the most respected families, presided over debates. Beneath him, local jarls and tribal elders oversaw their own districts.
stretches of coast, salmon rivers, and inland hunting grounds. The structure resembled a Norse thing, yet was softened by the Algonquian habit of consensus and the Beothuk practice of speaking until quarrels cooled. The Vestfolk did not crown a king in the old European sense. Their leader was guardian as much as ruler, his power earned through fairness, courage, and success in war or trade. But as their territory expanded and their confidence grew, chroniclers in Greenland and Norway began to speak of a Vinlandic kingdom, a name that flattered the settlers and lent weight to their negotiations across the sea. What bound this realm together was not only shared ancestry, but also the pulse of commerce. Furs remained the colony's blood life: beaver, fox, marten, bear, and the prized black-pelted otter. Hunters packed their spoils in woven sledges, hauling them to rivers where shallow craft waited. From there, goods flowed to Vineborg's wharf, where long ships and broad-bellied knarrs rocked in the tide.
Dried cod, seal oil, and timber joined the exports. European merchants coveted Vinland's straight pine beams and the rich amber fat rendered from whales and walrus. In return came iron bars, whetstones, wool cloth, and the occasional barrel of ale or honey-sweet mead. The Greenland settlements thrived as staging posts, their fortunes lifted by this minute transatlantic artery. Even Icelandic traders, once cautious of the long crossing, dared the voyage, lured by tales of markets heavy with pelts and carved walrus ivory. A few Norwegian skippers followed, their sails whitening horizons that had once belonged only to codfishers and seabirds. Europe, too, felt the tremor. Wealth from across the Western Sea enriched Scandinavian coffers. The kings of Norway and Denmark, long locked in rivalry, found cause to court their Vinland cousins. By 1180, royal letters addressed to the High Jarl spoke of "our loyal men beyond the sunset." They offered token gifts, silver crosses, books, fine swords, and hinted at alliances. This attention emboldened the Kalmar chieftains who would one day unite Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The notion of a Northern Ocean Empire gained traction, a band of Norse realms stretching from the Baltic to the forests of Markland. While still fragile, the dream nudged policy in subtle ways. Taxes on Greenland softened. Shipwrights were urged to perfect hulls fit for the Western run. Meanwhile, Southern Europe watched with curiosity and a little envy. Merchants in Bristol and La Rochelle whispered of a Norse land beyond Iceland where iron and fur were traded like grain. Genoese mariners noted Vinland on Portolan maps as a distant ice-rimmed coast. To them, the Atlantic was no longer a mystery, but a route guarded by northern sailors.
Inside Vinland, society ripened. Jarls governed hamlets and forts, each supported by free farmers, fishers, and craftsmen. At their side stood native headmen, respected for forest lore and mediation skills. Beneath them were thralls, prisoners of skirmishes or debtors working to buy freedom. Though the institutions softened over time, shaded by indigenous customs that favored adoption over permanent bondage. A council at Vineborg heard grievances, disputes over timber rights, accusations of theft, quarrels about dowries. Verdicts often required compensation, salmon, cloth, or labor, rather than blood. Only treachery, repeated theft or murder merited exile. Even then, some exiles found refuge with allied tribes, proving that law in Vinland prized balance over fear. Faith, too, wove old and new. A modest church stood on Vineborg's rise, its bell calling folk to mass on feast days. Yet near the harbor, a carved post bore runic prayers, while beyond the fields lay stone circles where hunters left gifts for land spirits. Some families baptized infants, but also carved Thor's hammer on the cradle. Shamans taught charms for steady aim or safe childbirth, and priests sometimes blessed fishing fleets with psalms learned in Berging. The people sensed no contradiction. The world was wide enough for saints and whites alike.
To guard their trade routes, the Vesterfolk built river forts and signal towers along cliffs. They developed hybrid craft, half longship, half canoe, capable of swift travel through fjords and estuaries. Warriors drilled in both shield wall and woodland ambush, learning to blend Norse discipline with the stealth taught by forest scouts. Contact with Europe carried a subtler threat: sickness. Ailments like measles and pox arrived not in a single devastating wave, but as smoldering embers born on merchant ships. Outbreaks flared, killing many, yet survivors gained resistance. Over generations, immunity accumulated among the Vesterfolk and their indigenous allies. Populations shrank, then steadied, bruised but not erased. This gradual exposure spared Vinland and much of the northeast from the catastrophic plagues that would later ravage unprepared peoples elsewhere. By the 13th century, confidence spurred exploration beyond Vinneborg's comfort zone. Traders ascended the St. Lawrence, establishing a post near the site of modern Quebec. Others skirted Nova Scotia and Maine, mapping coves rich in shellfish. Adventurers described a vast inland water, perhaps Lake Ontario, and spoke of plains where enormous horned beasts grazed. The kingdom's influence reached deep into the continent, not by conquest, but by webs of exchange. Some voyages sailed farther, to Baffin Island for walrus, to Labrador for fine slate, even down the Atlantic seaboard as far as Cape Cod, where they met new Algonquian speakers. Each expedition added brushstrokes to the mental map of a continent, teaching that the world beyond the fjords was larger than any saga had dared to imagine.
By 1300, a traveler standing on Vinneborg's headland would see a settlement transformed. Timber halls and sod cottages clustered around a stone-lined harbor. Sails furled beside moored ships. Smoke curled from charcoal pits. A market bustled with fishmongers, fur dealers, and women selling bannocks sweetened with honey. Children played a game mixing Norse dice and native painted stones. Inside the fortress hall, the High Jarl presided over councils. His chair flanked by carved totems and woven tapestries depicting both Midgard serpents and woodland spirits. Scribes, some from Greenland, others Vesterfolk raised, kept annals on vellum and birch bark alike. The realm still measured its years by hardship, storms, lean cod runs, fevers. But it also counted triumphs: a record harvest of barley, a new shipyard upriver, the safe return of scouts from a month's trek inland. Europe, meanwhile, was reshaping under the pressures of crusades, commerce, and royal consolidation. News of a sturdy Norse kingdom across the ocean intrigued scholars and kings. Chronicles in Paris and Bologna mentioned Regnum Vinlandiae, often alongside marvels like Prester John or Cathay. But unlike those legends, Vinland sent furs and timber that merchants could touch. By the mid-14th century, trade ships from Bristol and Galway risked a furtive run to Markland, swapping cloth and tin for cod and pelts. These clandestine ventures irritated Hanseatic merchants, who feared losing their monopoly on northern products. Quietly, they lobbied Scandinavian rulers to tighten control over their western cousins, though distance blunted any enforcement.
When plague scoured Europe in the late 1340s, Vinland watched from afar. Sparse shipping and the colony's relative isolation spared it the worst. Still, a few vessels carried sickness west, trimming Vinneborg's population but not gutting it. In Europe's recovery, Norwegian and Danish kings leaned even harder on their Atlantic outposts, seeking revenue and new fish stocks as continental fields lay fallow. For Vinland, the crisis meant opportunity. Fewer European ships meant higher demand for dried cod and furs. The colony weathered famine and chill, but emerged with strengthened bargaining power. By 1400, nearly 4 centuries had passed since Bjorn Iron-Willed's stand. His descendants and their allies presided over a realm stretching from Newfoundland's tip, through Labrador's rivers to Cape Cod's sandy spits. Inland, trading trails reached the Great Lakes. Along the coast, signal fires linked a chain of watchposts. Vinland had become a regional power, modest beside Europe's kingdoms, but formidable in its hemisphere. Their warriors bore mail shirts tempered with native leather, their axes balanced for both battle and woodcraft. They knew how to hold a shield wall and how to vanish into spruce shadows. Their ships, marrying Norse clinker planking with sleek native lines, could ride out Atlantic squalls or skim shallow bays. The Vestertfolk looked west with curiosity and east with wary pride. They sensed the world beyond the sea was stirring, Italian mariners charting routes, Portuguese caravels nosing down Africa's coast, Spanish courts debating how to rival them. Few in Vineborg guessed that within a lifetime, Southern Europe's hunger for gold and spices would send fleets crashing into their carefully balanced world. For now, the kingdom thrived in its own rhythm, smoke curling from winter hearths, sails lifting on spring tides, scouts paddling upriver through morning mist. It was a society forged where 2 continents touched, not fully Norse, not fully native, but wholly its own. By the 15th century, the Atlantic world had grown restless. New sails dotted its horizon, and in distant courts, kings and merchants whispered about trade, conquest, and the hidden wealth of lands beyond the sunset. Yet in this timeline, the waters were already claimed, before Spain or Portugal ever dared to gamble on the Western Sea. The Vesterfolk, descendants of Bjorn Iron-Willed and their indigenous kin, had woven a net of settlements, alliances, and watchtowers along North America's northeastern rim. The age that would one day be called exploration did not begin with an empty map. It began with a collision course. By 1490, the Kingdom of Markland, as it was known in Europe, had matured into a sturdy maritime realm. From its heart at Vineborg, stone quays stretched into a cold harbor thrumming with life, fishing boats unloading cod, merchants bargaining over bales of furs, smiths hammering iron cleavers while children chased gulls along the tide line. Northward, fortified hamlets dotted Labrador's rivers. Southward, a chain of beacon fires marked the approach to Cape Cod. Traders carried news and goods inland, following rivers toward the Great Lakes, where partners among the Wendat and Anishinaabe waited with copper, hides, and stories from farther west. Vinland's fleet was unlike any other. Longships still glided over open water, but new hulls, sleeker than a nar, broader than a canoe, skimmed shoals and river mouths. Their planks, pegged in Norse fashion, were caulked with spruce gum and sealed with seal oil. On their prows, carvers blended ravens and owls, wolves and serpents, knotwork merging with native curves. Its warriors were equally hybrid. Some wore mail over buckskin, others padded jerkins stitched with iron scales. They trained with bows, lances, and axes alike, equally at home in a shield wall or a forest skirmish. Behind them stood farmers and fishers, tending fields of barley and beans, orchards of hardy apples, and corrals of ponies that grazed on salt-blown grass.
The Vesterfolk did not see themselves as colonists clinging to a foreign shore. They were home, and their kingdom stretched beyond the reach of any European throne.
Across the ocean, Europe was shedding the last shadows of the medieval world. Printing presses churned out treatises on geography. Genoese cartographers argued over the size of the globe. Portuguese pilots hugged Africa's coasts, searching for spices and gold. Spanish envoys, gathering rumors in London or Bruges, began to fret. How far south did Vinland's authority stretch? Could its ships block a direct crossing to Asia? Was there space or profit left for Iberian crowns? At the center of these anxieties stood Vineborg, a thriving port and fortress whose walls had grown thick over centuries. Stone replaced sod in many houses. Glass panes, rare but prized, glittered in meeting halls. Workshops lined narrow lanes, tanners scraping hides, coopers bending staves, women spinning wool beside baskets of dried cranberries. Within the hall, the High Jarl presided over an oak table polished by generations of debate. On its surface lay carved maps of coasts and rivers, etched runes naming distant posts, Haukford, Sholand, Red Maple Bay. Visitors brought tribute, a carved wampum belt, a net of silver fish, a sheaf of parchment from Greenland chroniclers.
The court spoke a supple tongue, part Old Norse, part Algonquian, peppered with words borrowed from traders far inland. Poets sang of Bjorn's resolve, of wolves seen in moonlit clearings, of ancestors whose spirits walked the northern lights. Despite their strength, the Vester folk knew peace was fragile. Envoys monitored rivalries among Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Wendat bands. Scouts patrolled for hostile war parties or European sails. The memory of famine and plague tempered ambition with caution. South of the Pyrenees, Spain's new monarchs faced a dilemma. Portugal's fleets hugged Africa and the Indian Ocean. Venice and Genoa hoarded eastern luxuries. To compete, Spain needed a bold stroke. Yet every proposed route west struck against the same obstacle: Markland. Even the visionary navigator Christopher Columbus, a restless Genoese mariner, found his petitions rejected more quickly than in our own history. Advisors reminded the crown that a Norse kingdom already occupied the mid-Atlantic coast. Why risk offending an established power for a route likely to end in dispute? Still, curiosity gnawed at Iberia's court. Were there passages south of Vinland's reach? Could the ocean's bulge below the known coast hide untapped riches? Cartographers speculated about a vast southern continent lying beyond the Vinlanders' patrols. By the mid-1490s, Portuguese explorers, driven by rivalry, tested the idea of sweeping far southwest, beyond the familiar currents. Spanish spies took note, urging their sovereigns to stake a claim before their neighbors secured a foothold.
Meanwhile, along the warm coasts of what we call Brazil, Tupi-speaking villagers sometimes found curious artifacts, an iron knife here, a fragment of chain there, faint echoes carried by native trade from far to the north. When the first Iberian caravels nosed into these bays, they did not meet untouched societies. Word of strangers with thunder weapons had already drifted upriver, mingled with tales of Vestral folk ships hunting whales in far-off seas. The peoples of the tropics prepared greetings mixed with caution. To the Vinlanders, such news arrived through a lattice of messengers. Traders from the Great Lakes recounted rumors from yet further south. Foreign sails, strange flags, men who burned powder to kill birds mid-flight. The High Jarl's Council debated whether these were tall tales or a genuine threat.
North America, on the eve of European intrusion, was not a silent wilderness. Across forests, prairies, and deltas, societies had already woven responses to 4 centuries of contact with Norse iron and intermittent disease. The Mississippian cities near Cahokia hammered metal from northern merchants into ceremonial blades. Along the St. Lawrence, Wendat traders tallied debts with birch bark ledgers. In the far west, stories of pale sailors and their copper cauldrons mingled with legends of sky-born spirits. Even the Aztec and Inca realms far to the south bore faint fingerprints of the north, a copper chisel, a shard of woven wool, tales of plagues that came and receded rather than annihilating. The slow burn of exchange had toughened them, giving resilience absent from our own timeline.
The stage was set for an encounter not between conqueror and victim, but between rivals, each bearing weapons, stories, and ambitions. In 1491, Markland's council convened in emergency session. Scouts reported 2 sleek ships far offshore, neither nar nor fishing smack, but caravels with high castles at bow and stern. They kept their distance, yet their presence stirred unease. Some jarls urged an alliance. Approach these newcomers, trade wine for furs, learn their intent. Others argued for warning shots and firm borders. Memories of plague stoked fears of unknown pests carried by foreign keels. Younger warriors whispered of glory, a chance to prove themselves against strangers. The High Jarl, mindful of Bjorn Iron-Willed's legacy, counseled patience. He reminded them, a kingdom endures by watching as well as striking. Patrols shadowed the alien sails while envoys prepared words in cautious Latin. Further down the Atlantic, Iberian captains probed bays and estuaries, seeking places to anchor beyond the Vinlandic sphere. They found willing guides among coastal peoples who saw advantage in fresh trade. Timber, parrots, bright feathers, and even rumors of inland gold whetted European appetites. Yet every southern expedition risked crossing paths with Vinlandic fishing fleets, ranging far for whales and cod. The Norsemen, surprised to see tall-masted strangers, marked their hulls and reported swiftly home. Diplomacy grew urgent. Greenland's bishops offered to mediate, urging the Iberians to treat the Vestfolk as equals rather than obstacles. Letters bearing royal seals and runic signatures passed between Vineborg and Seville, heavy with courtesy and veiled warning. For a few years, the Atlantic hung in tense equilibrium. Iberian ships skirted the tropics, Vinlandic watchmen scanned horizons. Neither side wished to spark war, not yet. Vinland's leaders fortified their southern harbors and quietly improved their fleets. Sails grew broader, hulls sturdier, and new sea wolves, agile craft built for pursuit, slipped from Markland's shipyards. Crews drilled with crossbows and throwing spears, while forest allies prepared ambush trails along likely landing beaches. Iberian planners, meanwhile, refined maps and trained pilots in celestial navigation, convinced a prize awaited beyond Vinland's reach, if only they dared far enough. By 1498, the line could stretch no further without breaking. Portuguese mariners, sailing wide, touched the bulge of South America. Spanish captains debated whether to seek permission from Markland or press boldly into contested seas. Vineborg's scouts brought home fragments of pottery painted with odd coats of arms, beads of unfamiliar glass, and stories of pale men planting flags on beaches under a red sun. At night, the High Jarl studied these tokens, aware that the kingdom faced a challenge greater than famine or winter: the ambitions of distant empires. For 4.5 centuries, the Vinlanders had balanced between worlds, grafting Norse roots to American soil, nurturing a society of fur, iron, and shared song. Now the horizon promised change on a scale they could scarcely measure. Cannons and caravels threatened to rewrite the quiet contract between sea and forest. Would diplomacy prevail, weaving newcomers into the old alliances? Or would Europe's hunger ignite wars across river valleys and cod banks? No one in Vinneborg's hall could yet know, but all sensed the age of simple watchfulness was ending. On a clear autumn evening in 1499, fishermen on a headland north of Cape Breton spotted sails glowing crimson in the sunset. The ships were larger than any they had seen, their banners bright as spilled wine. Drums beat as a horn signaled from the watchtower. Messengers ran to the High Jarl. The world Bjorn Iron-Willed had secured, a world of quiet harbors, steady trade, and wary but respectful neighbors, stood on the brink. Beyond the waves lay powers ready to challenge not only Markland's borders, but its very story. The next century would decide whether Vinland's patient experiment endured, or whether Europe's hunger would tear the fabric of a hemisphere.
The year is 1498. 4.5 centuries have passed since Bjorn Iron-Willed planted stakes above a cold Newfoundland bay. From that gamble grew the kingdom of Markland, a patient realm of cod and furs, forest trails and iron forges, river posts and stone-walled halls. It has weathered blizzards, famine, and fevers. Now, a new storm gathers beyond the horizon, ships flying the flags of Castile and Portugal. For generations, the Atlantic had belonged to the Vestralfolk and a handful of hardy traders from Greenland or Norway. But Iberia's caravels, low in the waist, high at stem and stern, carry a new ambition. They come not only to fish or barter, but to claim. South of the equator, Portuguese captains tack westward, daring a long, empty run beyond Markland's watch. Their reward is a green shore where broad rivers pour into the sea. They step ashore on what we know as Brazil, planting banners in the sand. Here, Tupi villagers greet them cautiously. Some remember tales of northern traders who bartered knives for feathers, but these strangers smell of wine and carry weapons that breathe smoke. Gifts are exchanged, parrots, beads, iron nails. Yet behind the smiles lies a quiet calculus. Will these pale men stay or vanish like ghosts? The news moves inland along trade paths and up the continent's spine. Messengers whisper of foreigners with thundersticks and armored horses. When stories reach the St. Lawrence and later Vinneborg's court, the High Jarl's council knows the rumors are true. The world beyond their borders has arrived.
Vinland's leaders meet through nights of debate. Some elders urge restraint, send envoys, offer safe harbors in exchange for tribute or strict boundaries. Others call for firmness, bar southern sails from northern waters lest they plant rival colonies on cod banks or timber coasts. Younger warriors, their axes freshly whetted, speak of glory and raids. The High Jarl remembers Bjorn's first lesson: watch before you strike. But he also knows the old balance is shifting. For centuries, the kingdom prospered because it was useful to neighbors and distant Europe alike. Now it faces powers too large to ignore. Scouts strengthen patrols along the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Forts on Cape Breton and Nova Scotia are stocked with grain and bolts for crossbows. Shipwrights experiment with heavier hulls, able to mount small stone throwers or primitive cannon cast in Greenland. In Seville and Lisbon, royal councils parse reports from captains. They know Markland commands the richest fishing grounds and the main gateway to furs. But they also hear of a huge continent farther west and south, forests thick with dyewood, valleys rumored to hide silver. Some advisors propose friendship with the Norse, treaties to divide coasts, perhaps joint patrols against pirates. Others, eyeing wealth, argue for pressure, establish posts beyond Markland's sight, and squeeze its trade. By 1502, Portuguese factors have founded a timber station near modern Pernambuco. Spanish sailors hug the Caribbean, noting islands fertile and thinly defended. Across Europe, appetite for American riches swells.
Contact between Iberians and Westerfolk comes not in war, but in wary meetings at sea. Off Newfoundland's southern capes, codfishers hail caravels. Voices carry across water in broken Latin, Old Norse, and Portuguese. Barrels of dried fish and marten pelts swap for salt, wine, and a few precious guns. Yet unease lingers. Iberian helmsmen mark Vinlandic harbors on charts. Vinlandic skippers note the size and armament of caravels. Each side studies the other, weighing strength. Meanwhile, along the Gulf's quieter inlets, Spanish pilots tempt Micmac and Malecite hunters with beads and knives, hoping to bypass Veneborg's tariffs. Tensions rise when a Portuguese trader bribes a small band to seize a Norse shallop. The culprits vanish inland, leaving frayed tempers behind. To steady the frontier, the High Jarl dispatches envoys, one Norse, one Wendat, to Lisbon. They carry gifts, carved ivory, a codex of laws, and a wampum belt woven with copper wire. Portugal's court receives them politely, but presses for concessions, rights to fish and cut timber, freedom to settle south of Cape Breton. Veneborg replies with courtesy, but stands firm. Markland guards the northern seas, the letter reads. Guests are welcome if they honor our borders. We do not yield them. Spain, busier with Caribbean ambitions, adopts a subtler tactic. Their captains court tribes along Florida's coast, offering steel to enemies of Vinlandic allies. Rumors spread that Spanish priests dream of baptizing the continent, not just trading its wares. Beyond these diplomatic games, the Columbian exchange begins in miniature. 5 centuries after Bjorn's landing had started its slow counterpart. Iberian horses arrive, their hooves drumming Vinlandic beaches within a decade. The Westerfolk quickly adapt them for scouting and hulling timber, creating a new breed, stocky, sure-footed, able to thrive on northern grass. Grapevines from Portugal take root near sheltered coves. Apple grafts from Vinland travel south. Potatoes, maize, and tobacco spread earlier across Europe, ferried not only by Iberians, but by Markland merchants already accustomed to hybrid farming. Diseases travel too, but their toll is blunted. Centuries of gradual exposure have left much of North America scarred, yet standing. Epidemics flare, but rarely erase whole peoples. Alliances hold fast because partners are alive to honor them. Peace proves fragile. In 1511, a Spanish carrack trespassing near Vinlandic fisheries refuses inspection and fires a warning shot. Markland's coastal bard, surprised but unbroken, boards her after a brief skirmish. No lives are lost, but Seville protests loudly. Soon after, Portuguese settlers push north from Brazil, recruiting local fighters. A Vinlandic trading party is ambushed on the Orinoco Delta. Survivors limp home with grim tales. Debate erupts in Veneborg's council chamber. Should they defend allies far south or keep strength close to home? The High Jarl decides on caution, sending only advisors and ironwork to friendly tribes, but not troops. Markland's reach is long, yet its population, perhaps 200,000 scattered across coasts and valleys, cannot match Iberia's endless ranks. The richest flashpoint is not jungle or goldfield, but the Grand Banks, where cod gather in astonishing numbers. Iberian ships arrive by the dozen, scooping fish once monopolized by Vinlandic fleets. At first, tolls are negotiated. Later, captains ignore them. By the 1520s, seasonal skirmishes pit Norse knarrs and Algonquian cutters against caravels bristling with culverins. Neither side wins decisively, but Markland learns a hard truth. Old tactics of shield walls and quick raids cannot dominate open water battles. They begin forging heavier cannon and training gunners, blending seamanship with forest cunning. Yet amid quarrels, cultures seep into each other. Iberian charts adopt Vinlandic place names, Hvidfjord, Red Maple Sound. Markland carpenters copy Mediterranean sail rigs, while Portuguese smiths buy Vinlandic bog iron, prized for its purity. Missionaries venture north, debating theology with priests who still sprinkle holy water while carving Thor's hammer. In return, Vinlandic skalds carry songs of Iberian saints back to longhouse hearths, where they sit beside tales of ravens and river spirits. Far from Vineborg, Spanish campaigns in the Caribbean and Mexico unfold against a different backdrop. Native states, hardened by long exposure to northern trade and plagues, prove less brittle. Cortez's thrust into the Valley of Mexico meets organized resistance, supplied in part by smuggled iron from Markland merchants who prefer balance to monopoly. In Peru, Inca lords, warned by traders, scatter herds and fortify passes before Pizarro's men arrive. Victories still come to Spain, but slower, costlier, never absolute. By mid-century, Markland responds to mounting pressure by weaving tighter bonds with forest confederacies, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and coastal Mi'kmaq. Councils formalize mutual defense pacts. Vesterfolk riders, descendants of Norse farmers and Algonquian hunters, patrol as dragoons, bows across saddles, axes at their belts. Together, they hold the Gulf and St. Lawrence, frustrating Iberian hopes of easy annexation. Trade continues, but always under the watch of Vinlandic garrisons. By 1550, the collision of worlds has reshaped the Americas. No single empire rules. Instead, a mosaic spreads from Arctic ice to Amazon floodplain. Markland, cautious yet firm, holding its fisheries and forest routes. Iberian colonies, strong in the south but wary of long northern supply lines. Indigenous confederacies, trading, negotiating, sometimes warring, always adapting. Europe's appetite still gnaws, but the hemisphere is not a blank canvas. It is a palimpsest of sagas, chants, treaties, and skirmishes, written in many hands. On a calm evening around 1560, an aged sailor stands on Vineborg's quay, watching lanterns flicker along the waterfront. Behind him lies a history no chronicle in our world ever recorded. 4 centuries of mingled peoples shaping a shared shore. Ahead, ships with square Iberian sails wait beside long, low craft painted with ravens and wolves. The sailor smiles faintly. The world has grown crowded, but Bjorn Iron-Willed's gamble endures. His descendants still speak in 2 tongues, still forge iron beside frozen rivers, still tell children of the night their ancestors chose to stay. The collision has come, but it has not erased them. Instead, it has folded Vinland into a larger story, one of rivalry, exchange, and survival, on a continent where history itself turned down a different path. As dusk settles over Vineborg's harbor, lanterns gleam against the darkening tide. Fishermen coil ropes, a skald strums a quiet tune, and gulls wheel above ships whose sails bear a medley of ravens,
crosses, and Iberian lions. Across the water, the low hum of a forge mingles with the soft chant of evening prayers in 2 languages. Here, on this imagined shore, the arc of our what if draws to a close. We've followed the Norse from Leif Erikson's tentative landing to Bjorn Iron-Willed's defiant stand, through centuries of trade, diplomacy, and hard-won resilience. We've watched as Vinland grew from fragile outpost to sturdy kingdom, meeting Iberian caravels not as prey, but as rival and partner. History, of course, did not take this path. In our world, the Vinland settlements faded, their memory preserved only in sagas and archaeological traces. Europe's empires arrived to find peoples who had never been tempered by steady contact, and the meeting was devastating. But imagining a different tide lets us glimpse other possibilities. A hemisphere shaped by cooperation and caution rather than conquest alone. It reminds us how small choices, a leader's patience, a willingness to trade before striking, can ripple outward across centuries. As you drift towards sleep, picture the coastlines of that alternate North Atlantic. Spruce forests leaning over quiet bays, watchfires flickering on headlands, voices singing both sagas and river songs. Hear the steady knock of a shipwright's mallet, the soft breath of a horse on frosted grass, the hush of waves folding against a cobbled quay. The story ends there, where 2 continents meet under a northern sky. Not with a single triumph or tragedy, but with the enduring work of people learning to share a world. Now, as the lanterns of Vineborg fade, let the stillness of history carry you to rest.